Welcome to State of the State, the monthly roundup of politics and economic news, brought to you by the Institute for Public Policy and Social Research at Michigan State University and our friends here at WKAR Studio. I'm Arnold Weinfeld, Associate Director at the Institute, and I'm joined by my co-hosts, Dr. Matt Grossmann, Director at IPPSR, and MSU economist Emeritus now? Is that
Emeritus, yes.
MSU economist Emeritus Charley Ballard. So, gentlemen, since the last time we met, we've had an election, and I think there was a lot of surprise all the way around, not just here in Michigan, where we've had a change of power in the House, in the State House and the State Senate, but across the country, where a suspected, quote, red wave in Congress turned out to be something of a trickle, although Republicans have taken control of the Congress. But Democrats have retained control of the Senate and might have outright control of the Senate after the Georgia runoff election. Matt, what did you see out there?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily agree that it was a trickle overall. The National House popular vote moved from about 3 percentage points in favor of Democrats to about 3 percentage points in favor of Republicans, which is a little less than normal for a midterm election of a new president. But the Republican gains were not concentrated in places where they mattered for the outcome. So the seat share gain was a lot less than normal in the U.S. House. They mainly gained in districts that they were already winning by a significant margin. And there were big state differences. New York and Florida, for example, moved quite a bit to the right, and states like Michigan and Colorado bucked the trend entirely and moved to the left instead. And in our elections, we had the governor win by 10.5 points statewide, and the other statewide races also almost uncompetitive, which was not necessarily what we were expecting. Of course, the House and the Senate at the state level also moved to Democratic control. But there again, there's a little bit of an illusion caused by the redistricting process in the middle, which is that statewide House and Senate candidates in the Democratic Party won by about 1.5% across all races. Almost every House and Senate Democrat underperformed Whitmer compared to their own candidacy in their own district. Or another way of saying that is every Republican overperformed Tudor Dixon in their House and Senate races. But that statewide margin is about the same as it was in previous elections. It's just that under the new maps, that meant a new majority. It meant a majority that matched the statewide vote, and that gave control to the Democrats. So a sea change in Lansing and less than normal change nationally in the midterm election.
Matt, IPPSR and yourself, along with other folks down at the Ford School at U of M, helped to support the efforts to rewrite the maps. What was the impact of those maps?
It was quite significant. It was necessary but insufficient for Democrats to win control of the legislature. Under the old maps, they would not have won control of either chamber. But they still had to win the statewide vote, and that was not at all clear that that was going to happen before the election. So the maps did not make the Democrats win, but they made the statewide vote consistent with the chamber margins. And that was not something that was easy to do. It's much easier to gerrymander in favor of Republicans than to gerrymander in favor of Democrats. And making an even map in Michigan requires pretty precisely allowing for the creation of competitive or Democratic districts in different parts of the state.
Like the Lakeshore District. I mean, we now have a Democratic state representative from far west Michigan, I guess you could say, right along the lakeshore. I mean, that's one of those districts you're talking about. Is that right?
Right, and that district on a map looks gerrymandered in the sense that they went out of their way to collect Democrats along the lakeshore and not collect too many people further inland in order to make that district competitive or slightly Democratic leaning. But from the perspective of the state as a whole, you have to do that to enable the statewide vote to be consistent with the margins in the legislature, because Democrats are much more concentrated geographically in Michigan than Republicans.
Yeah, and that was really I think the toughest part, the catch-22 of that process, is how do you do that? I think the 35th State Senate District that runs from all the way from Bay City to Midland and includes Saginaw is another one of those districts that flipped, but is another one of those that kind of looks kind of odd in order to accomplish what the goals were. So those are the maps. Now let's turn to the issues that were in front of voters. Up until about mid-October, Democratic hopes were pretty high across the country. And then all of a sudden it seemed as if the discussion turned to the economy, gas prices, inflation. And the last 2 weeks, I know in talking to some Democratic polls, they were not confident of much, except maybe here in Michigan, the governor's race, of course, and the Secretary of State. But even the Attorney General's race was supposedly pretty close, and that did not turn out that way. So what was it here at the end of the day, nationally or in Michigan? Abortion seemed to be a top issue here in Michigan for sure. That ballot proposal won with, upper 50s. What were the issues here in Michigan and nationally, and how did they play a role?
Well, certainly abortion is the top candidate for why Michigan performed differently than other states. We had an abortion proposition on the ballot. It was competitive. There was spending on it. It brought out voters who might not normally vote in a midterm election, so it made our turnout actually go up, and that could have made a difference for why Michigan trended a little bit more to the Democratic side than the national electorate. The other potential candidate is Whitmer's incumbency advantage. It seemed to be bigger than people were expecting, and if she had any coattails at all, it might have brought across the line that final 1% that Democrats needed to gain control of the legislature.
And Charlie, what about the economy? I mean, certainly that we kept hearing the last month, it's the economy, stupid. How did that play a role or not play a role?
Well, the economy was certainly Republicans aimed at that issue in their campaign. And it's true that the economy is not in fabulous shape. But I think a couple of things. One is, as Matt said, wherever abortion was on the ballot, Democrats did well. One of the reasons why Democrats did poorly in New York State was that abortion is safe there. It wasn't on the ballot, and so you got there wasn't that groundswell affecting the vote. But the economy is it's not as bad as some people portray it. When you have unemployment below 4%, when you have, even though GDP has grown slowly, officially it shrank in the first 2 quarters of this year, but that was really due to quirks of inventory swings and swings in net exports. The fundamentals of gross domestic product, consumer spending, investment, those have continued to grow. Now, 2021 was a gangbusters growth year, largely a rebound from the COVID recession. You can't maintain that year after year. So 2022 we knew was not going to be a fabulous year, and then because of inflation, the Federal Reserve has pushed on the brakes. And so the economy is not in a great shape, but are we in a recession? No, we are definitely not in a recession. Could we be in a recession 6 months from now? Maybe. I think it's I think avoiding a recession is a little bit less than 50-50, but it's not zero. The Princeton economist Alan Blinder has a new book out, and he was the vice chair of the Fed in the 90s. And he's pointed out that in the last 60 years, about half the time when the Federal Reserve is tightening things up, we avoid a recession, or at least we avoid a hard recession. So there's 3 outcomes. There's no recession, soft landing. There's soft-ish landing, like 2001, which was a recession that was so mild that you if you squint, you couldn't see it in the data. And then there's hard landing, which would be 1982 recession or the Great Recession of 14 years ago. I think the most likely is either soft or softish, and that's good news. Nobody, of course, who knows, with China, with North Korea, with Ukraine, with all of the weirdness in the world, there are things that we can't predict. But on the basis of the things that we can predict, most economists are saying, yeah, there will be, unemployment might rise into the 4s or the low 5s. That's not catastrophic. That's not a great recession, and so that's what I'm hoping for.
Yeah, so the 2 points you bring up there is consumer spending continues.
Right.
And low unemployment. So people are working and someone's making money somewhere.
Someone's making money somewhere.
And that continues to drive the economy. But I think the issue over the rail strike that's with us right now, it's pretty clear that even the Democrats in Congress are going to make sure that at least, you mentioned Ukraine, you mentioned China and everything, at least try and make sure that at least as many systems as possible are working like they should be here in the United States to avert inflation.
Because a rail strike would cause major disruption, which would mean that a lot of things that you used to be able to find on the shelf, you'll have trouble finding at all, or if you can find it, its price will be
right,
higher.
Right.
And of course, the thing that we always need to say about inflation or lots of other economic phenomena is, if you're making $250,000 a year, if you're affluent, it's chump change. It's irritating, but you don't have a choice between do I make rent or put food on the table. For the lower part of our household income distribution, inflation is really, really a problem, and we need to keep that in mind. It's not something that affects everybody equally.
Right. Great point. Matt, nationally, it seems that Republicans somewhat took a beating. Many of the candidates that Donald Trump endorsed did not win office. In Arizona, for instance, Carrie Lake looks like she lost that governor's race. What do you make of the national picture? Is it still the case that all politics is still national now?
Well, certainly the national swings were more consistent with the normal national picture in a midterm election than these important Senate elections where voters knew the candidates and selected more on that basis. That's always true to some extent. Split ticket voting was actually down in this election slightly, so the voters' ability to kind of select between the candidates is still a small proportion of total races, but it was enough to swing a lot of these major races, and Donald Trump is a prime suspect in why that is happening. His endorsed candidates performed about 6 points worse in House elections, not to mention the Senate elections, where he endorsed candidates with less experience than all their alternatives that were available, candidates that were perceived as more extreme than other candidates that were available, and it made the election less of a referendum on Biden with his low approval and more of a choice between Biden-preferred and Trump-preferred candidates. And that does seem to have made a difference in several of these major Senate elections. You can tell that because governor elections were on the same ballots in some cases. And, for example, in Georgia, there was no problem in the governor election where Brian Kemp distanced himself from Trump. And we're still fighting out another runoff in the Senate election where we got Herschel Walker on the Republican side because of Donald Trump.
We did a forum, IPPSR does monthly public policy forums, and obviously the one we did a few weeks ago was on the election. And you started it off by making a comment. I think it was, "Welcome to the first day of the 2024 election cycle." What do you see moving forward?
Well, yeah, everybody got a week off, and then Donald Trump announced his candidacy for the next election cycle. So we always say that the campaign starts right after the last one, but this time Trump made sure that was the case. it still is odd. I mean, this is the time when everybody is tired of hearing about politics. You do not think that this is like the way to get a lot of, positive media attention for a new candidacy. But they barely held him off from announcing before the election. He almost announced 2 days before the election, and he announced that he was going to announce. So this was the last possible time.
He announced that he was going to announce that he was going to announce that he was going to announce.
Exactly. So they barely held him off, and he decided to announce at not a great time for running a presidential campaign, but he's in there. We knew he was going to be, and it's going to be a long cycle.
One of the best things that I take from this election is that, with a few exceptions, Kari Lake I think is the most notable. People who lost elections admitted that they lost, and they accepted defeat. That is something that I think is absolutely crucial for a well-functioning democracy, and it's something that we saw greatly deteriorate a couple of years ago, and I hope that makes a big-time comeback. I do expect that if Donald Trump is the Republican nominee for president in 2024, that he will either win or say that he won. I don't expect that he will ever say that he lost. But I'm glad that a lot of people, Tim Ryan's accession speech in Ohio was admirable. He said, look, we had a fair fight. I lost. And that's the way it should be in a democracy.
And we also saw fewer problems with certification.
Yes,
we saw fewer problems with election day voter intimidation. So a lot of things that we were potentially worried about turned out to be better than expected. But that's another case where the Trump effect is probably pretty clear. Without him being out there saying, let's not certify, let's not do this, we have fewer of those problems, but that doesn't mean that they won't return.
Yeah, and, one of the candidates who still hasn't conceded is the Michigan Republican Secretary of State candidate Karamo. So it seems to me, in general, when that occurs, the public says, you lost, go away. The public recognizes there's no big stink that, oh yeah, this person won't concede, there's a problem here, except we see that in Arizona, which was a very tight race.
Yes.
So 2024, let's go there for a moment. Clearly, the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, had what I would call an overwhelming victory against the former governor, Charley Crist, and seems to have positioned himself fairly well for moving forward with a run at the Republican nomination for president against Donald Trump. Mike Pence, the former vice president, has been quite active publicly and tries to be distancing himself. But in terms of strong candidates to challenge Donald Trump as standard bearer of the party, who do we see other than Ron DeSantis?
Well, it's going to be important for Republicans who don't want Donald Trump to be the nominee to consolidate behind an alternative. They don't have to do that now. There's a long time to go, but you don't need a whole lot. You just need one. Ron DeSantis won by about the same margin as Marco Rubio. There were other candidates that outperformed their state fundamentals by more. So I don't know that it was sort of super impressive, but it was impressive enough, certainly compared to Trump's performance in the election, which was to endorse people in a lot of winnable seats who lost. So for Republicans looking for electability, Ron DeSantis certainly looks much better right now. Historically, that has not been enough to win Republican primaries. You cannot just say this candidate is unelectable. I'm the more electable one. You have to say I'm better at representing conservative values. I have something that this other alternative candidate doesn't have. And so it'll be interesting to see if electability is enough. But there's a lot of evidence now. Donald Trump underperformed the House Republican vote in 2016. He underperformed the House Republican vote in 2020. He suffered a bigger than normal loss in the 2018 midterm election. And his endorsed candidates did worse than his non-endorsed candidates in the last 3 cycles. So So that's a lot of evidence that his electability argument is not so strong.
In the last couple of weeks, Donald Trump has embraced white nationalists more, white supremacists more fervently than before, and he's also cozied up with anti-Semitic folks in ways that he hadn't done before. And press reports indicate that there are a lot of Republicans who are upset by that. Do you think that that will make much of a difference, or has he already gone so far to the right that this is not going to do anything?
There definitely are indications that his support is lessening and that there were not people who were on board before ready to jump in with him at this point. And that's true in funders. It's true in endorsements, like the evangelical community, for example. But I hesitate to say another media hubbub is going to sink Donald Trump when we have seen so many, and so many with good background information that should lead people to change their opinions of Donald Trump, but haven't so far. So yes, there are signs, but I think not because of the latest.
We'll see. Yeah.
Well, and we can't get away with just talking about Mr. Trump. Certainly, there is, I would say, a fairly strong undercurrent in the Democratic Party that President Biden should not run again. He will be over 80 years old when he runs. And, there's a lot of people that say, Joe, you did well. You stabilized the country. You certainly did better than any president has done in midterm elections. Go out on top, and the House Democratic leadership has stepped aside, Nancy Pelosi and Steny Hoyer, for younger blood. How do we think that conversation might play out over the next year?
Doesn't seem to have convinced Joe Biden yet, and he's in a stronger position than he was before the election. So I don't see it very likely that he's going to step aside unless there's a new health problem that develops, or even more visible deterioration from age. And again, you can't beat somebody with nobody, so there would have to be consolidation around an alternative. And the same people who don't want Joe Biden to be the nominee don't necessarily want Kamala Harris to be the nominee, who would be the most likely alternative. So, we might wish for different, but we still might see Biden versus Trump again.
My own view is that Kamala Harris has, if she were the Democratic nominee in 2024, she would not be as strong a candidate as Joe Biden, unless Joe Biden has some health deterioration.
And what about our own governor, Governor Whitmer? Double-digit win. She had been mentioned even before this election on the national scene. Do we think that she'll play a bigger role in national politics moving forward?
So she was vetted for the vice presidency. She was already in the mix. It's dependent on kind of what the dynamics of how long she has to wait. But certainly a Midwest governor winning by a large amount, who already had some national profile, is going to continue to be mentioned regularly. And has an argument. Michigan is also now more likely to move up in the Democratic primary process. The Democrats are trying to do that officially for next time, and it looks like we're getting the most attention for moving up into those top four traditional first four primary states. So. And of course, that has a long history as well. We've been trying to move up, but we have a better argument now, and it looks like it really could happen.
And Charley, looking forward to 2023, you mentioned that your view is we'll see a soft or softish landing. Michigan still continuing to compete for chip plants. The president, as a matter of fact, was in the Saginaw Bay City area just this past week visiting a chip manufacturer. We've got 10 cranes, I counted the other day, on the west side of this community over in Delta Township, building a new battery plant for Ultium. How do you see Michigan's economy continuing to evolve over the next year or so?
Well, I see it fairly similarly to what we've seen for decades now. Doing okay, but we haven't. We were the strongest economy in the world in the middle decades of the 20th century. And then with the decline of manufacturing in general and autos in particular, we have struggled for decades now. And the Commerce Department recently brought out the state-by-state data for 2021 for per capita personal income. And Michigan slipped to 34th. Which is kind of in the ballpark where we've been, but we were up all the way to 32nd a couple of years ago, and so it's a very mixed picture. One of the biggest reasons why we are not higher is that we remain less well educated than the national average. And if you try to use statistical techniques to explain the difference in per capita personal income among the 50 states, the percentage of the population who have at least a bachelor's degree explains 2/3 of that variation. It's hugely important. And we're a couple of percentage points below the national average in bachelor's attainment. And then another picture of that is in the places where you've got highly educated populations, Ann Arbor, parts of Oakland County, our economy is fabulous. In some of our central cities and in many of our rural areas. You look at northeastern Lower Peninsula. There's just not much going on. Population is declining in most counties in Michigan. So if you're in a part of Michigan that's been doing well, every expectation is that will continue to do well. If you're in Lake County or Missaukee County or Alger County or Luce County, boy, there is just not a whole lot going on, and I wish I could snap my fingers and come up with a way to fix that. But these are challenges in many of our rural areas that have been going on for the better part of a century. Well, the population of the Upper Peninsula is smaller now than it was in 1910, so. That's just an indication of that economic growth in the United States is very uneven, very unbalanced.
Right. I was going to say that's actually what you described as reflective of what you see across the country.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
Right. Michigan
absolutely.
is not an anomaly in this.
The story that I just told for Michigan, you could tell that story for just
state.
about every state.
Right. Right. Yeah. Back in 1910, I think Calumet was considered for the state capital. So, so there you go. The Upper Peninsula has certainly seen many would say better days economically and within state power structure. Matt, going into this legislative session here in Michigan, Democrats hold a one-seat majority in the House and the Senate. Congratulations, but certainly nothing to, I would say, shout about that they're going to take over the world in terms of public policy. That's a very, very tough. Having experienced that myself, it's the slimmest of margins, right? And but yet you have. I read a report the other day where. At least half of the Republican caucus in the House are election deniers. How do you think the dynamic's going to work between Democrats that you've noted are mostly from urban suburban communities? Yes, their districts include some rural areas. There's no doubt about that, but mostly from urban suburban communities. And Republicans that mostly represent rural areas of the state. What kind of dynamic is that going to lead to, you think?
Yeah, historically, this is a small majority, one that is, threatened by any small health condition or, potential issue with keeping your caucus all in town and together. It is true that there's not your kind of Joe Manchin equivalent in the Michigan House or the Senate, a representative of a clearly more conservative area, but there are a lot of representatives that are in swing districts that are going to be concerned that they might not get the same vote that they got this time next time. And historically, winning chamber control and winning the governor's election is associated with a decline in your vote share the next time. We expect there to be at least a little bit of a return in the other direction. Some of that is dependent on how much policy actually changes and how visible it is. So if they are able to change things without people noticing too much and without there being a large public hubbub and a big move leftward or perceived big move leftward, that will help them keep their majorities more. But we should keep in mind that the expected changes, although, the first time in 40 years, there's a lot on the plate, but we shouldn't necessarily, and that is the time when you would expect the most policy change. Still, on average, across the states, if you look at where kind of the ideal position of the Republican Party is versus the ideal position of the Democratic Party, we expect each year of full control by one party to move the state policy about 1% in their direction, on the scale of from where Democrats want it to where Republicans want state policy overall. So there'll be movement, but it will not necessarily be as much as people are expecting.
So you're not expecting a sea change. One thing that I would point out that makes a difference is, okay, you've got 56 to 54. Narrow majority. But a lot will depend upon the behavior of individual people, including the leaders. And I hearken back to 30 years ago when we had a 55 to 55 tie in the House of Representatives. And in no small part due to the goodwill of Paul Hilligans, the Republican co-speaker, and Curtis Hertel Sr., the Democratic co-speaker, that legislature actually got some things done. And so if you have people who are committed to working together and to listening and doing the hard work of legislating, you can have better outcomes. And if you don't have that, you can have worse outcomes. So we'll see what happens.
Having worked for co-speaker Hertel during that time, I can attest to what you say about the two personalities and how they made it work. So it certainly will be an interesting session. Matt, the one point you bring up is that there are actually more competitive seats under this map and tighter races. So your point about individuals and how they will react to one piece of legislation or another, depending on their own seats and their own legislative districts this time, will certainly make a big difference. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for the conversation. Insightful as always. Appreciate both of your perspectives and the work that you do. Our thanks to WKAR Studios and Russ White and his crew for their continued support. And to you, our listeners, join us again next time on State of the State.